Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 156, The Imposter. Herbert Charles Bazin appeared in a Bendigo newspaper article in 1890 under the title An Imposter. I was intrigued to know more about this man, and he and his family proved interesting. Herbert Charles Bazin was born on the 4th of September 1853 at Dalston, Hackney, Middlesex, England. He was the third child born of 6 and the son of Charles Bazin and Mildred Mary Philpott. His father was a clerk at the time of his birth. In 1861, his father Charles was in partnership in a shop with John Mecchi. John Mecchi was an Italian. They sold traditional cutler's wares, dressing cases, chessboards, small tables and portable desks. In 1859, he was promoted from manager to partner with John Mecchi, and the business was expanded to 112 Regent Street in Middlesex, England. This is also the address where Charles Bazin and his family were registered as living in the 1861 census. One of Charles and Mildred's children, John, was named John Mecchi Bazin when he was born in September 1855, so the men must have been close and had a lot of respect for each other. Charles died in 1865 at the age of only 40 when Herbert was 12. In the 1891 census, Herbert's sisters, Helen and Mildred, were governesses, and brother Vivian was a shipping insurance clerk, and they were all living with their mother. They had a general servant living with them as well. In later records in Australia, it was described that he came out on the Winifred in 1875. However, he arrived from London as a 17-year-old on the 26th of September 1870 to Melbourne on the Hydaspes. It stated that he was a clerk. The first record that I found of him was actually in 1918, but it's in reference to 1878. It says a £1 reward left at Mrs. Robertson's in Colac 40 years ago, a copy of The Freedom of City of London. Anyone having it, please forward it to Herbert Charles Bazin of St Arnaud. Freedom bestowed on his father, Charles Bazin. Original in Guildhall, London. What does the freedom of the City of London mean? Well, it started in 1237 and the status of a free man was protected by the Charter of the City of London and not under the jurisdiction of a feudal lord. So basically this was a freedom or right to trade. In 1835, the eligibility for the freedom of the city was extended to anyone who lived in, worked in or had strong connection to London, and it generally was seen as a prerequisite for standing for election to the Common Council or the Court of Aldermen of the City of London. On the 25th of June 1879, in the Melbourne Herald, there is an article titled Extraordinary Conduct. Last week, plainclothes constables Hutchison and Radican were attracted by the strange behaviour of a young man named Herbert Charles Bazin, who was walking along the street swinging a long Enfield rifle upon his shoulder and capering about in such an extraordinary manner that it was found necessary to arrest him for fear of serious consequences resulting therefrom. The charge was one of insulting behaviour, but when the officers questioned him as to where he was going and how he became in possession of the firearm, he stated that he had 2 other guns of the same description, with which he was going away to Queensland to catch the Kellys, and he'd bought them from a dealer named John Roberts in Wellington Street, Collingwood. Upon interviewing Roberts, the officer found out that on the 20th, the prisoner came to his shop, selected 3 of the rifles therefrom, from which he tendered 2 cheques on the National Bank, one for £2 3 shillings and the other for £1 10 shillings. The cheques were apparently endorsed by Dr. Brownless, and at the request of the prisoner, Roberts accompanied him to the house of that gentleman, who was absent, and left 2 of the guns there. Thinking it was all right, the dealer changed the cheques, which were subsequently returned, marked no account. The constable made further inquiries and found that the man had at one time lodged at the Supreme Court Hotel in Russell Street, stole a coat and a watch therefrom belonging to Copeland, who, becoming incensed at the conduct of one to whom it appears he had always shown the greatest kindness, issued a warrant for his arrest, which, however, was not satisfied. Constables Hutchison and Radican arrested him before those who held the warrant had time to put it into force. The overcoat was pawned at a shop in Lygon Street, Carlton, and the watch at a shop of Abraham Levi. The prisoner pled guilty and said that he was respectable once, before he drank, but as soon as he took to the course of intemperance, he began to go downhill. He was sent to jail for 12 months on the 2 charges lodged against him. When searched at the watch house, he had 2 cheques upon him purporting to be signed by the Honorary W.J. Clark, and it was further found that he had victimised a Mr. Walsh, jeweller, Collins Street, to the amount of £5 by the same means. Mr. Walsh, however, declined to prosecute. And it also mentions on the 27th of June 1879, for some days past it has been currently rumoured in Colac that Herbert Charles Bazin, who for a short period was a clerk in one of our local business establishments, had been committing innumerable crimes in Melbourne and that he was wanted by the police. A little more than 2 months ago, Bazin left Colac heavily in debt, and since that time he's been loading about the streets of Melbourne, sticking up every person he knew for a loan of a few pounds. At first he succeeded, victimising one local resident to the extent of £7. After this game was played, he fell back on the last resort of a man in that position, passing valueless cheques and stealing various articles, which he afterwards pawned. It looks like this game has not lasted long. So as a result of that offence, I found a Victorian jail record for Herbert Charles Bazin, and it stated that he was 5'4.5", stout build, fresh complexion with fair hair and grey eyes. It stated that he was born in 1854 in London and was a clerk. And the offence ended up being 6 months hard labour and another 6 months hard labour due to larceny and false pretences. And this is the record that said that he came out on the Winifred in 1874. And he received his certificate of freedom on the 10th of May 1880. In the New South Wales Police Gazette on the 23rd of June 1880, it says in Sydney, a warrant has been issued by the Central Police Bench for the arrest of a man who gave the name of Malcolm Edwards, who can be identified, charged with feloniously uttering a forged cheque for £2, 19 shillings and 6 on the Bank of New South Wales, Sydney, purporting to be signed by James Phillips to George Frederick Law of George Street. Description, 36 years of age, 5'7", stout build, light hair, moustache and whiskers, round features, high forehead, has a defect in left eye, dressed in a dark serge suit and black silk hat, gentlemanly appearance, supposed to be identical with David Galloway Stewart. Since arrested, he gave the name of Charles Henry Bazin. From this report, it seems that David Galloway Stewart could have been another alias used by Herbert Bazin. However, looking into him, he's 10 years older than Herbert. He's of different physical description and he had a wife in Brisbane and children. So it's quite possible that Herbert just used his name when it was convenient for him. David Stewart had his own misdemeanours and when he was imprisoned, sometimes at the same time as when Herbert Bazin was already in prison, so they don't quite match up. Different men, but I think somehow they've crossed paths, and I found that with a couple of the aliases that Herbert had. It seems that he borrows a man's name, quite possibly because David Stewart was a mariner. If he was off at sea, he may have felt that it was convenient to be able to use his name when getting caught. In the Sydney Morning Herald on the 24th of June 1880, Herbert Charles Bazin was charged with feloniously altering a forgery. George Frederick Laws of George Street hatter deposed that on the 17th, so only a month after he was released, the prisoner purchased a hat from him and in payment tendered a cheque purporting to be drawn on the Bank of New South Wales by James Phillips for the payment of £2, 19 shillings and 6. He said that the cheque was drawn by Mr. Phillips at Prince Og and Companies. He believed the statement, accepted the cheque and gave him the balance. When he presented the cheque at the bank, it was not paid. Evidence was given that no person signing as this cheque was signed has or had an account in the Bank of New South Wales, and that no such person is or was at the date connected with the firm or employed by them. He was committed for trial at the Quarter Sessions. And he was sentenced a month later. Herbert Charles Bazin, forgery, 2 years hard labour in Darlinghurst. And it says that his conduct was good and he may be released after serving 6 months. And it was remitted and he was released in 1881. On the 17th of June 1882 in the Sydney Morning Herald at the Newtown Police Court, yesterday before Mr Clark, Herbert Philpott, so using another alias, charged with attempting to pass a valueless cheque for £1 with the intent to defraud F. Paul of Homebush, and he was committed to the Court of Sessions with bail allowed at £50 and sureties of £25 each. And he featured in the Police Gazette a couple of weeks later. Herbert Philpott, alias Bazin, alias Mort, alias Cross, alias Smith, charged with fraudulently obtaining the sum of £1, 18 shillings and 9 pence from Rhodey Moroney, and has been brought before the Redfern Police Bench under a writ of habeas corpus and committed for trial at the Court of Sessions. So as a result, on the 27th of July 1882 in Sydney, he was charged with false pretences and forging and uttering. He received 2 12-month jail terms concurrent with hard labour in Darlinghurst Jail, and the aliases listed in his New South Wales jail record were Philpott, Hall, Wilson, Mort, Cross, Benjamin and Smith. The next time he features is in August 1885, and it says Herbert Charles Bazin was ordered to be imprisoned for 2 months on a charge of obtaining several articles of wearing apparel by means of false pretences from Mr W.P. Latimer of Queen Street, Wallara. The prisoner was further sent to jail for 3 months for uttering a valueless cheque to one George T. Jameson of Oxford Street, Paddington, with the intent to defraud. 6 months jail was awarded to Herbert Charles Bazin for obtaining a suit of clothing and other wearing apparel to the value of £20 from Henry Wallach by means of false pretences with the intent to defraud. So with the charge to do with Henry Wallach, he was arrested by Constable Lilly by the Sydney Police and sentenced to 6 months hard labour. And then with fraudulently obtaining goods from W.F. Latimer, he was sentenced to 2 months imprisonment. Then uttering a valueless cheque for George Jameson, he was sentenced to 3 months imprisonment, and uttering a valueless cheque for £2 to Henry Summerfield of Pitt Street with intent to defraud. That sentence was dropped. He was discharged with no prosecution for that, so he got a total of 11 months jail at that time. Not long after he was released from his 11-month jail term, he married Agnes Mildred Mackay at St Michael's Church in Surrey Hills on the 2nd of December 1886. Herbert was 32 by this stage, and Agnes stated she was 21. She was in fact 17. Agnes had been born in Surrey Hills, New South Wales, on the 11th of May 1869. She was the third of 5 children to John Mackay and Janet Barclay Henderson, who were both Scottish. They had married in Dramana, Victoria in 1863 when Janet was 23 and John 25. John was a butcher. In 1895, John was found dead in the bush. Just a warning, a description of when they found him is quite graphic. It says about 3 weeks ago, a miner named John Mackay, who lived in a tent near Maynard, was missing from his home. As it was surmised, he'd wandered into the bush and had been lost. The police made a diligent search for the missing man, but without success. On Saturday, however, the body was found 6 miles from the tent, lying on its side in a decomposed state. A horse belonging to the deceased was found hobbled close by, and it is supposed that Mackay had gone in search of it. An inquest was held. A Masonic certificate of the Grand Lodge of Scotland was found on the body of the deceased, who was 56 years of age. Dr. Llewellyn, the government medical officer, deposed he'd made a post-mortem examination on the body of John Mackay. The head had been destroyed by maggots, but the hair and beard were there. The side was much decomposed, and the death appears to have taken place 2 to 3 weeks ago. He died from cold and exhaustion. There were no marks of violence on the body, not even marks of a struggle where the body lay. There was a wallaby skin cap beside the body. The deceased had evidently died without a struggle, and the verdict was found according to the evidence. The horse he was supposed to be looking for was found close to the body in hobbles, and it's thought the old man caught the horse but was unable to take him back through weakness caused by want of sustenance. Herbert Bazin and Agnes Mackay had 2 boys, one in December 1887 at Queanbeyan, New South Wales, and in the latter half of 1889, Herbert is listed as living at Wallenbean, New South Wales. In May 1890, in the Bendigo Advertiser, an article titled An Imposter. For the last couple of days, a married man about 35 named Herbert Charles Bazin has been going about victimising various business people in the city. On Tuesday night, he called at Mr. W.J. Langley's grocery store in Sandhurst and informed Mrs. Langley, who had been in charge of the shop during her husband's temporary absence, that the mayor, Mr. J.P. Carolyn, had sent him down to purchase a quantity of groceries consisting of 6 tins of jam, 6 pounds of bacon, 2 pounds of coffee, 2 pounds of tea, 1 dozen eggs, 4 tins of condensed milk, 4 tins of fresh herrings, 4 tins of salmon, 2 tins of kippered herrings, 2 tins of haddocks, 1 tin of Digby chicks, 6 large and 6 small tins of sardines, 4 tins of lobsters, all valued at £3, 1 shilling and 3 pence. Bazin told Mrs. Langley that he would take the bacon and eggs with him and that she could forward the other goods direct to Mr. Carolyn. Bazin then took his departure. Before leaving, he complained of the high price of the eggs, but added immediately afterwards, "People giving parties must put up with these things." Subsequently, the articles were forwarded to Mr. Carolyn, when Mr. Langley, to his astonishment, found that no one had authorised to make the purchases on Mr. Carolyn's account. Yesterday morning, Mr. Langley interviewed Detective Sergeant Mahoney and, acting on his advice, procured a warrant for Bazin's apprehension. Just before the time that the warrant was being issued, Miss Carmichael, who has a fancy goods repository at Dr. Atkinson's buildings, called in Senior Constable Cantwell, who was on duty in the vicinity, and reported that a man, who afterwards proved to be identical with Bazin, had called into her shop on the previous evening and selected £4 worth of fancy goods. Amongst them was a silk handkerchief, which he said he would put in his pocket. He did so at the same time, telling Miss Carmichael to wrap the other things up. He then asked for a blank cheque, but Miss Carmichael declined to accept a cheque, whereupon Bazin signified his intention of calling in the following yesterday morning and paying for them. He then left, taking the handkerchief with him. After he'd gone, Miss Carmichael remembered that the man had taken the handkerchief, and she also missed a silver thimble from the counter. Later on, he nearly victimised a local bookseller and stationer. The police set about to find the imposter, and about 3 o'clock, Detective Sexton effected Bazin's arrest at his home in Rowan Street, where he has been living with his wife and family for a fortnight. He will appear at the police court this morning for obtaining goods by false pretences from Mr. Langley and larceny of the silk handkerchief and silver thimble from Miss Carmichael. A remand will probably be applied for. And 5 days later, in the City Police Court, false pretences and larceny, a man named Herbert Charles Bazin was brought before the bench on remand, charged with obtaining goods under false pretences and the larceny of a thimble and handkerchief. The defence was that the accused had been drinking and did not know what he was doing. In answer to the usual questions from the bench, the prisoner pleaded guilty and threw himself on the mercy of the court. He said that when he'd been drinking, he committed very foolish acts. The goods had been sent back to the persons from whom they were obtained. His wife was not very strong just now, and he hoped the bench would deal leniently with him. Mr. Patterson asked, "Do the police know anything about him?" And Inspector O'Flaherty handed up to the bench a record showing that the accused was in trouble in New South Wales 6 years ago. So that would have been 1884. Mr. Patterson remarked that no one seemed to have suffered, and there appears to have been some doubts about there being any false pretences, and the accused would be discharged. In reference to larceny of the thimble, and the accused then said, "I had the things ready to send back when I was arrested." And the judge said he would be sentenced to 14 days imprisonment with hard labour, and the prisoner was then removed to jail. It says in that jail record that he was born in London and he was a baker, that he was born in 1853, and his description was 5'5" tall, fresh complexion, fair hair, blue eyes, nose long and sharp. Another son was born in Carlton, Victoria in September 1890. And it seems that around this time, Herbert deserted Agnes and the children. Herbert was listed in the Bendigo Petty Sessions records as Herbert Bazin on the 22nd of July 1893 for larceny, and he received 7 days imprisonment. His description said slight build and high thin nose. In early 1895, he was working as a groom in Kyabram, and on the 22nd of July 1895, he was jailed in Deniliquin, New South Wales for being drunk. In August 1895, on his son Herbert's ward records, it stated that he was working at Pine Ridge near Deniliquin. Their second son, Rupert, was christened in September 1899 when he was 9 years old, and Herbert is stated as being a baker. I'm not sure, though, whether Herbert was present at the christening of their son, or whether Agnes just listed Rupert's father on the christening record. On the 25th of October 1902, under the name Charles King, an alias listed as Charles Bazin, he was arrested for indecent exposure in the Numurkah Petty Sessions Court and jailed for 3 months in Melbourne. Stated on this record he was from England, a clerk who was born in 1852, and it also stated he'd had 2 previous convictions in Victoria. On the 21st of April 1916, he was arrested under the name Frederick Charles Bazin for being drunk and disorderly in a public place in Donald, Victoria, and was fined. And he was recorded as living at St Arnaud in 1917, Herbert Charles Bazin, at Cope, a cook. In 1920, the Army sent him some correspondence, and his address was at Kangaroo Grounds, Eltham, Victoria, so in May 1920. And then in 1924, as Herbert Charles Bazin, living in Dundas Street, St Arnaud, as a labourer. And Herbert Charles Bazin died under the surname Bazin in 1925, and it was recorded in Castlemaine, Victoria. Herbert and Agnes's children. The firstborn Herbert Vivian Bazin was born on the 14th of December 1887 at Queanbeyan. He was committed as a ward of the state on the 5th of April 1895 in Kyabram as a neglected child. In the Kyabram Free Press on the 12th of April 1895 it says Herbert Bazin, aged 6 years, was charged with being a neglected child and was committed to the industrial school. The notes said that he had been in the care of 2 women at Kyabram, that his father was Herbert Charles Bazin, a labourer who had deserted and was supposed to be in New South Wales. He was a groom living at Kyabram and was known as a drunkard. And in 1895, the information they had was that his mother was dead, which in fact Agnes wasn't. History of relations says that the father was in the care of Mr. Jones at the unemployment camp and then at Pine Ridge in Deniliquin, New South Wales, in August 1895. In May 1895, Herbert Jr. was sent to Avoca but absconded from care on the 12th of November 1900. He was then returned but again absconded on the 7th of January 1901 and again absconded on the 14th of May 1905. By 1912, he was released from care and was under the name of Herbert Charles Neal. He was living in Queenscliff, Victoria, and his occupation was a soldier. He did enlist in World War I. Herbert wrote on his military record that he was born in Avoca, so he thought he was born in Avoca, Victoria. His next of kin was his cousin, James Martin Cudmore of Mildura. At this stage, I'm unable to find any link between the Cudmore family and either the Bazin or any Neal family that might show a link to make it a cousin relationship between the men. And he enlisted on the 19th of August 1914 as a corporal, and his unit embarked from Melbourne on board Transport A24 Benella on the 19th of October 1914. He was ranked as a company quartermaster sergeant in the 8th Battalion, and he returned to Australia on the 20th of October 1915. He was living at Mildura by May 1916 and obtained land under the Soldier Settlement Scheme in February 1917. Herbert Jr. married Olive Thompson on the 3rd of April 1918 in Mildura when he was 30 and Olive 23, and they had 3 children. Herbert enlisted in World War II as well as Lieutenant Herbert Charles Neal. Again, he stated that his birth was at Avoca, Victoria. He enlisted on the 7th of October 1939 in Lang Lang, Victoria. His next of kin was his wife Olive, and he was discharged on the 2nd of March 1944 from the 17 Garrison Battalion. He then had another enlistment in World War II with the Royal Australian Navy, and this has slightly different records. It says that he was born on the 12th of December 1888, not the 14th of December 1888, and it states he was born in Queanbeyan, New South Wales on this one. He enlisted on the 24th of January 1945. Again, his wife Olive is the next of kin. He was posted on the HMAS Lonsdale and was discharged on the 12th of May 1949. Herbert died on the 17th of October 1971 in Bendigo, aged 83, and he was buried at Merbeen near Mildura. The second son of Herbert Charles Bazin and Agnes Mackay was Rupert Charles Bazin. He was born on the 1st of September 1890 in Carlton, Victoria. However, his military records said that he was born at sea off the coast of Colombo. Rupert was baptised in North Melbourne in September 1899, so when he was 9 years old. In 1901, he was handed over to the Gordon Institute for Boys in East Melbourne. In 1912, he was living at Tungamar in northern Victoria, working as a labourer. In the 1914 census, he was listed as working as an artisan, so someone that has skilled work with his hands, and living in the city of Melbourne. Rupert enlisted in World War I on the 1st of October 1914. He initially wrote that he had no relations in Australia, so he mustn't have had contact with his brother. He listed a friend, Mr. E. Perkins of Devonish, Victoria, but the record was later changed to his mother Agnes, stating that she was living in Abbotsford, Victoria. His occupation at the time of enlistment was a fitter, and he embarked at Melbourne on the Transport A38 Ulysses on the 22nd of December 1914 as a private. Rupert died on the 1st of May 1915 at Gallipoli, and his rank was a Lance Corporal at the time of his death. His probate in Victoria was under the name Bazin. On the 3rd of June 1915, under the Roll of Honour, it says Lance Corporal Bazin. An official announcement has been received by Reverend E.C. Perkins that Lance Corporal Rupert Bazin, a former resident of Tungamar, was killed in action at the Dardanelles on the 25th of May. He was about 26 years of age, and his quiet disposition and studious austere had gained for him a large circle of friends here and in other parts. Whilst residing in Tungamar, he was employed for some time by Mr. D. Condie and also at the bakery establishment of Mr. W.H. Phillips. He resided with Mr. and Mrs. Perkins at the Methodist parsonage in Devonish, which place he was persuaded to look upon as his home. About 2 years ago, he went to Melbourne, where he was studying for the Methodist ministry when the war broke out, and he was among the first to enlist for active service. Much sympathy is expressed for Mr. and Mrs. Perkins, who looked upon the fallen soldier as their own son. It says he was originally a Livingston homeboy. He was a fully accredited local preacher, and he was in training at Wesley House last year up to the time of sailing with the Expeditionary Force. And there was an article related to Methodist Homes for Children on the 25th of June 1915. Our readers will have seen in the last number of The Spectator an account of Lance Corporal Rupert C. Bazin, who we are proud to say was one of our boys. He came to our home as a little lad, and then after a while went to the country. When he was 18, he drew his money in order to purchase books for study and came to Melbourne with a view to equip himself better for the carrying on of Christian work, to which he decided to devote his life. When war broke out, he enlisted and was killed in action. It has been his, in his enthusiastic and eager self-surrender, to reach what Christ marks as the highest grade of human love. And then it mentions Wesley House and says that he obtained a situation nearby to be able to continue his studies and make arrangements with a tutor to coach him, settled down to fit himself by hard and close study for good work for God. He came to our place as a local preacher on trial. He approved himself to our local preachers' meeting and came to a full plan. In our Sunday school and in open-air services, he gave himself very heartily to any service that he could do. When war broke out, he was exercised in his mind as to what he ought to do, but at last there came a clear conviction as to duty, and he offered for the Expeditionary Forces and was accepted. He went to Broadmeadows and at once took his stand for God. He proved himself to the military authorities and was soon promoted to Lance Corporal. He left with reinforcements for the 14th Battalion and was evidently in the hard fighting of the first days at Gallipoli. His messages from Egypt to Central Mission people were always cheerful and full of his faith in Christ. Evidently he did as he said and kept the flag flying. In his last letter to Mr. McCallum, written from Heliopolis, stating that he was just leaving Egypt for an unknown port, he expressed the feeling that he had no fear, saying, "The Lord is my strength and my refuge, of whom should I be afraid?" He was just in the full bloom of his manhood and has very early finished his course. To him the war was a challenge, and he went with a solemn sense that he was going where God would have him go. And he laid down his life for us, who are at home and in comfort, and we of the Central Mission uncover our heads and pay this tribute to one who hath this high honour, that his name stands upon the roll of a nation who hath buried her sons in many a land and many a sea, and yet who lives in her nationhood because her sons are willing to die for her. And then on the 10th of September 1915, it was said at an evening service, Mr. Kane told the story of his heroism. He was in the trench with one of our Wesley House young men, Mr. Rupert Bazin, when the latter was shot. The call came to Mr. Bazin suddenly, a bullet piercing his forehead. He was killed instantly. And then in his army records, there was a statutory declaration from his birth mother, Agnes Mackay. I, Mrs. Agnes Bilston, residing at 109 Yarra Street, Abbotsford, Victoria, declare that I'm the mother of the soldier who enlisted as number 818 Rupert Charles Bazin. I was married to his father, Herbert Charles Bazin, in Sydney on the 7th of December, 33 years ago, in the Church of England at Paddington, and my son Rupert Charles Bazin was born in Melbourne about the year 1890. I afterwards discovered that my supposed husband was already married, and he left about 25 years ago, as I am not aware whether he is dead or alive. My son, the above-mentioned soldier, lived with us until the age of 10 years, when, owing to my husband's desertion, I had to put my son in the Gordon Institute in Melbourne. I was not aware that he enlisted until informed by Reverend Mr. McCallum of the Wesleyan Church in Lonsdale Street, Melbourne, that he was dead. My object in making this declaration is that I desire to claim his war gratuity as his legal next of kin. So I have investigated it, and I'm unable to find any marriage record of Herbert Charles Bazin, either in England or in Australia. So quite likely he married somebody under one of his aliases, which I have tried to investigate, but unfortunately at this point that remains a mystery. And then his father Herbert wrote a letter on the 24th of June 1915. Dear Sir, I note from the records of the late number 818 Lance Corporal R.C. Bazin, 14th Battalion, that he was killed in action on the 1st of May 1915, and this was the response from the Army on the 6th of May 1920. Dear Sir, I note from the records of the late number 818 Lance Corporal R.C. Bazin, 14th Battalion, who was killed in action on the 1st of May 1915, that you claim to be his father. This soldier upon enlistment stated he had no relatives, but I also received a claim from Mrs. A. Bilston of Melbourne, who claims to be the soldier's mother, stating that she went through a form of marriage with the deceased father in Sydney and subsequently discovered him to have been a married man. In the circumstances, unless there are good and sufficient reasons as to why this should not be done, it is proposed to hand her the war medals and other items due on account of the deceased soldier as mementos of her son's service in the Australian Imperial Force. If no reply is received from you within 14 days, it will be accepted that you concur with the proposed procedure, thanking you in anticipation of the favour of an early reply. And it was addressed to Mr. H.C. Bazin, Kangaroo Grounds in Eltham, Victoria, and Herbert didn't respond to the Army. You would have noticed in the reference to the statutory declaration that Agnes had sent to the Army that she has a different surname. Agnes did remarry, but she didn't just remarry once but twice. So this is what happened to Agnes. After she was deserted by Herbert, Agnes married Charles Henry Thomas McGrath in Collingwood, Victoria on the 13th of August 1895. He listed himself as a widower and Agnes listed herself as a spinster. Agnes married under her maiden name and Charles married under the alias of Reynolds, as he had a wife already who was in an asylum in New South Wales. He had claimed he was a widower from as early as 1888. Charles was 35 and Agnes said she was 23 on the certificate when in fact she was 26. She listed her parents as John Mackay and Ellen Mackay, née Henderson. Charles was born near Redfern in 1860 and he married Mary Copley in Young, New South Wales in 1883 when he was 23 and Mary 19, under his surname McGrath. They had 3 children together, Charles Henry in 1884, Thomas Henry in Sydney in 1885 and Lillian May Judith in Young in 1886. On the 2nd of July 1887, in the Young Police Court, it says unsound mind. Mary McGrath, who had been remanded for a week to Young Jail for medical treatment, was brought before the bench this morning charged with being of unsound mind. Dr. Hockley deposed that Mary McGrath has been under my notice at the jail during the last 7 days. She has a weak intellect and is unable to take care of herself. I recommend her removal to the lunatic asylum. I have known her for several years and she has always appeared to me to be of weak intelligence. Her sister is in a lunatic asylum. She is inoffensive and harmless. Dr. Hutchings deposed, I have this day examined Mary McGrath. She was very peculiar in her manner. She rambles in her conversation and gives a long account of being persecuted and ran about, for which she can assign no clear reason, nor for her wandering about the bush. She seems quiet and inoffensive, but might at any time develop suicidal tendencies, and therefore requires to be kept under restraint. I recommend that she be sent to an asylum, and an order was made that she was sent to the Gladesville Asylum. On the 6th of February 1888, before the police magistrate, Charles McGrath was summoned by his wife, Mary McGrath, for having left her without the means of support. He should have appeared in answer to the summons on Friday, but having failed to do so, a warrant was issued for his arrest. Senior Constable Mackenzie deposed, "This morning at about 10 o'clock, the accused, Charles McGrath, came to the lock-up and gave himself up. I produced a warrant for his arrest, which I read to him in the lock-up. It charges him with having disobeyed summons, and he made no reply." The defendant then pleaded guilty to having left his wife without means of support, and in reply to the bench stated that he could not consent to again live with his wife. An arrangement was then entered into by which the defendant was to pay 6 shillings per week towards the support of his wife and to hand over the furniture exclusive of the books to her. On the 21st of August 1889, it was a Government Gazette notice, "Missing Friends." Inquiries are requested to be made with a view of ascertaining the present whereabouts of Charles McGrath, who is said to be employed in a butcher's shop in Sydney. He is 29, 6 foot high, dark complexion with a slight build. He is said to be living with a short, dark woman and has a girl 3 years old living with him, which I'm assuming would be Lillian. McGrath's wife is at present an inmate of Gladesville Lunatic Asylum, and he's required to contribute towards her support. And he is supposed to have gone to Narrandera. And only 3 months later, protection. Mary McGrath, an unfortunate young married woman who separated from her husband, has been taken up last week for protection and remanded to jail for medical observation. She was brought before the bench this morning and discharged upon the recommendation of the government medical officer. Mary McGrath died in Goulburn Mental Asylum in 1926 at the age of 62. Charles had a son with Sarah Sears, Herbert John Alexander Reynolds, on the 14th of August 1890 in Alexandra, Victoria. No birth record has been found so far. However, on Herbert Reynolds' marriage certificate, he stated that his mother was Elizabeth Hanson, which was a name that hasn't featured anywhere else. So it seems he was illegitimate and born between his father's 2 marriages, according to the ward register. So after he left Mary McGrath and before he married Agnes. Herbert Reynolds was committed to the Gordon Institute on the 20th November 1901, a couple of weeks after his father's death. Agnes Mackay was listed as his stepmother. He'd been tried in 3 homes and all were unsuitable. They cited he was lazy and untruthful. He was found at the Warrigal platform in Victoria on the 17th of February 1903, and he stated that he travelled under the railway carriage from Melbourne to Warrigal. Short article says, slept in a railway truck. Herbert John Reynolds, of no fixed place of abode, was charged at the Richmond Court on Tuesday with having trespassed on railway property. Evidence was given that the police found Reynolds sleeping in a truck at the Jolimont railway yard. A fine of 2 shillings 6 cost was imposed. A charge of having no lawful means of support was withdrawn when it was shown that Reynolds had some means. He was sent to the boys' depot on the 17th of February and then to the Bayswater Boys' Home on the 4th of March. He absconded on the 17th of August 1903. He was sent to 2 homes that didn't work out from the 3rd of September 1903 to June 1904, and then he was sent out again in July 1904, but absconded on the 6th of June 1908. Says Herbert Reynolds absconded from his hired service with FC Singleton Farmer at Narrachan, 17 years of age, 5'7", thin face, slightly freckled. On the 3rd of March 1909, he was committed at the Beechworth bench for larceny. Herbert Alexander Reynolds was charged with horse stealing and larceny of a saddle and other articles at Belmatum and pleaded guilty. Mr Mackay spoke in mitigation, stating that this was the accused's first offence. The Prison Gate Brigade of the Salvation Army were prepared to take charge of him if discharged on his own recognisance. He handed in letters testifying to previous good character. And a more detailed article on the event in the Benalla Standard, alleged larceny, a Belmatum case. At the Violet Town Court on Tuesday, a youth named Albert Alexander Reynolds, aged 18, was charged with stealing a mare, a saddle and a bridle, the property of Thomas Marr of Balmatin. The prisoner was a ward of the state. Thomas Marr, a farmer at Balmatin, said that the accused came to his place on December the 20th between 8 and 9 a.m. and asked for work. He was told that he had none. He asked if he could milk, and he said he could. The witness offered him a ride to Benalla the next day, and he was taken to a place for the night, and he stayed in Benalla overnight. When the witness returned at 5:30 a.m, he saw the kitchen door had been opened. He missed the saddle, the bridle, the buggy rug and a pair of scissors and the mare. The witness reported it to the police at Violet Town and Benalla. John Lucas, fruit hawker and dealer, said he was camped on the creek at Reedford on December the 22nd, and at 10 a.m. he saw the accused, who offered to sell him a mare, saddle and bridle. The witness paid £3 cash. He got a receipt, and the accused then filled his pipe and went away. Constable Adams, in charge of Tullarook, deposed to getting the mare, saddle and bridle from the last witness, who showed him the receipt. The witness then went to Broadford and, in company with Constable James, went to the railway station and found the rug in the waiting room. The accused was arrested by Constable James. The witness asked him where he got the horse, the saddle and bridle, and he said that he'd stolen them from Mr. Marr. The accused said, "I took 11 pence off the mantelpiece." He also owned to taking the scissors and the rug. When taken to the watch house, Constable James asked him what he'd done with the £3 which he had received from the horse from Lucas. The accused said that he bought clothes and spent the other money on cigarettes and his dinner. He had £1, 3 shillings and 2.5 pence remaining. Constable James, appointed at Broadford, said that he saw the accused at the station between 7 and 8 o'clock on December the 22nd and took him into the station master's office when he said the rug was in the waiting room and it was his property. He told the accused he was a constable and to be careful of what he said. The accused then stated that he sold the mare to Lucas and that he had purchased the mare, saddle and bridle from Williams at Euroa for £8. He told him that the horse was claimed by Thomas Marr of Violet Town. The accused then started crying and said, "I stole it from Mr. Marr." The accused pled not guilty and reserved his defence and was committed for trial at Beechworth. And as a result of horse stealing and larceny, he was sentenced to 6 months in prison, to be suspended contingent on his good behaviour for 2 years. So the prisoner was required to enter into a bond of £25. So he had a suspended sentence. However, on the 11th of February 1910, so around a year later, he was charged with larceny and he was given 14 days imprisonment at Colac, Victoria. Albert Reynolds tried at Colac Petty Sessions for larceny, native of Victoria, labourer, born 1891, 5'7", fresh complexion, dark brown hair and grey eyes, scar on right thigh, scar calf of left leg, scar left knee, first conviction. Then on the 3rd of February 1913, he was sentenced to 18 months hard labour for stealing from a dwelling under the name John Garland in Werribee, Victoria. In the Footscray Independent, it outlined the case, robbery at Werribee, constable's exciting struggle. At the Werribee Court on Wednesday, some sensational circumstances were disclosed in connection with a case of larceny. John Garland, 32, was charged with having stolen a silver watch and chain and a gold locket valued at £5 from the hut of Alexander Nylander at Werribee. The first witness was Andrew Rowan, a farmer on Geelong Road. He stated on the afternoon of the 3rd he saw 2 men walking about his farm. He asked them what they wanted and the answer was work. He said he could give one of them a permanent job as a milker and the other could have a few days. To this, one of them said that it was no good to them as they had been mates for 4 years and did not want to be separated. The 2 men were given a meal and he did not see any more of them. Witness identified Garland as one of the 2 men. Harry Walsh, an employee of the last witness, said that he saw the 2 men near Nylander's hut and identified Garland. Alexander Nylander said that he'd finished his day's work and went into his hut. He found the place had been ransacked. A pair of trousers, 2 silk ties, a silver watch and chain and a locket was missing. Suspicion fastened on the 2 men and accompanied by a companion, he rode after them. They found them along the road. The 2 men admitted they had been on the farm and he told them what he'd lost and asked them to open up their swags. This was done, but none of his missing property was in them. Then he asked them to turn out their pockets. Garland's companion said, "What do you take me for, a thief?" and drew out a knife. The witness thought it was time to go and later reported his loss to the police at Werribee. He identified the watch and chain produced in court as his, likewise a pair of trousers Garland was wearing in the court under dungarees. Constable Black told a sensational story. He saw the two men running along the pit beside the train and gave chase. Both made along the line towards the Newport workshops. It was very dark and he followed one of them, who proved to be Garland. He overtook him after running hundreds of yards along the Williamstown track. Garland tried to wrench himself out of his grip. A train was coming along. Garland tried to force him towards the moving wheels. They struggled hard and he had to exert all of his strength. At length he got Garland down and handcuffed his hands behind his back. On the track along which they had raced, witness picked up the watch and chain and someone else a sheath knife. Garland said he'd never seen the watch and chain before and that the knife did not belong to him. Around Garland's waist he found a belt and a knife sheath into which the knife fitted perfectly. A photo of Garland and another man was found among his papers. Garland admitted the second man in the photo was of his late companion. The accused gave evidence on his own behalf. He was a butcher, a poor working man. He had only known his companion a few days. He'd invited him to go on a trek with him and he'd gone. He received 18 months hard labour in Pentridge Jail. He was released on the 26th of May 1914. He enlisted in World War I on the 29th of August 1914 in Sydney. And in his Ward of the State records it says, "Boy is now in France with expeditionary forces in the 21st Brigade Artillery, 1st Division. He was also at Gallipoli." So his enlistment record, he enlisted on the 29th of August 1914. He was single and a butcher and 25. His next of kin was Mrs. May Paul of North Melbourne, Victoria, and he enlisted as a driver. And he embarked from Sydney on board the HMAT A8 Argyllshire on the 18th of October 1914. And May Paul is actually his half-sister Lillian. Albert Reynolds married Rosina Pirelli on the 16th of October 1917 in Tottenham, Middlesex, England, when he was 27 and Rosina 25. However, Rosina was proven to be already married and this marriage became null and void. Rosina was prosecuted for bigamy by authorities. He was court-martialled on the 15th of March 1918 for being absent without leave. He was also found to be wearing a badge of a rank of which he was not entitled to while he was absent without leave. He pled guilty and was found guilty, and his sentence was detention for 120 days. He was gassed on the 15th of September 1918 in France. On the 6th of March 1919, the Army sent a letter in response to Agnes Bilston. With reference to your inquiries at this office regarding number 2548 driver A.A. Reynolds of the 1st Field Artillery Brigade, whom you state is your son and is not a married man, I have to state particulars of the case have been referred to the Australian Imperial Force Headquarters, London, for investigation. And then on the 9th of May 1919, correspondence within the Army. Driver Reynolds was married at Stamford Hill, Tottenham, London, on the 16th of October 1917 to Rosina Marriott. It subsequently was ascertained that at the date of such marriage, Rosina Marriott was the wife of Andrea Moretti, an Italian now living in London. Mrs. Moretti, or Reynolds, is now being prosecuted for bigamy. Driver Reynolds wishes to add that Mrs. Moretti is applying for a divorce from Moretti and that on a decree being obtained, he intends to marry her. At the present time, Driver Reynolds is not legally married. Driver Reynolds states that Mrs. Agnes Bilston of 109 Yarra Street, Abbotsford, Victoria, is his mother. And an extract from the letter dated the 20th of December 1918 from Driver Reynolds in the 1st Field Artillery Brigade. Well, Mum, I haven't got married myself as I don't care about it. Just now I wouldn't be contented as I will wait until the proper Miss Right comes along. As for marrying over here, it's out of the question, but there are some of our fellows who have been doing so. If you could only see some of the things they are getting married to, you would say something. Well, of course, I was going with a girl over here, but she showed me a point as I dropped her straight away, which was the wisest thing to do, as I think too much of myself, too, as far as marrying is concerned, so don't worry, as I wouldn't dream of doing so. If you get a letter from any strange woman over here, don't take any notice of her explaining her troubles. So this is in case you do happen to get a letter from this woman. She showed me rather a dirty point. As I dropped her straight away, I did nearly thought she was all right. But you see, dear mother, one must live and learn. The girl might tell you things that are not true. She told me she should write to you and tell you everything that concerns my affairs since I've been over here. So if you do get a letter, write to her and make it pretty hot. Why I'm telling you this is because she was a married woman. So there you are. How easily a fellow can fall. Alexander returned to Australia on the 5th of September 1919 and was discharged from the military on the 24th of February 1920. In 1920, he was living at Royal Park and was a railway employee as a fitter's assistant. He married Mabel Neal on the 4th of March 1920 when they were both 29. Not sure if there's any link. The surname Neal is exactly the same spelling as what Herbert Neal had when he changed his name. By 1924, Mabel was living with a man named James Hallett in East Malvern. On the 9th of February 1929 in Warrigal, Albert was charged with offensive behaviour, and on the 3rd of June 1931 in Sale, he was given 6 months hard labour for being a rogue and a vagabond and for unlawful assault and wilful damage. And he was tried in the Morville Court. And the article related to that said, arising out of a recent attack on a watchman at your lawn electricity works, Albert John Edward Reynolds was charged by Constable Ryan at the Morville Court on Tuesday with assaulting Peter Wells. On the second charge of damaging a telephone, the property of the Electricity Commission, Reynolds was fined £1 and ordered to pay £1 compensation. A third charge of being a rogue and a vagabond and being on an enclosed area without lawful excuse, Reynolds was given 6 months imprisonment with hard labour. He was discharged from prison on the 22nd of December 1931. Mabel married James Hallett in 1939 and she stated that Albert had died in 1936, but there's no definitive records stating when he actually died. So getting back to Charles McGrath, or Charles Reynolds, and Agnes. On the 3rd of July 1901, there was an article in the Melbourne newspaper, Complete Breakdown. At the Coburg Police Court yesterday, a Coburg butcher named Charles Reynolds proceeded against a warder of Pentridge named Charles Harold Vine for being found at night without lawful excuse in a dwelling belonging to the informant. The prosecutor stated that on the evening of the 18th of June, he left his house with the intention of going to Brunswick for band practice, and as it was a cold night, he did not go and returned home. When he entered the parlour, he saw a man behind the door. He inquired what his business was, but he gave some unsatisfactory reply, and when he struck a light, the man bolted. He was quite sure the defendant was the man. The informant stated that when he returned home, his wife was in the passage. He admitted that he afterwards brutally thrashed her and that she had left him. The defendant on oath stated that he was never at the house of the informant and on the night in question was at home until he accompanied a lady visitor to her home about 9 o'clock. Mrs. Vine and the lady visitor corroborated, and the magistrate dismissed the case on its merits and allowed the defendant £2 2 in costs. Charles McGrath, or Charles Reynolds, died in East Melbourne only a few months later on the 8th of November 1901, aged only 41. Charles and Agnes had 2 children. The first, Irene Selina Reynolds, born on the 1st of June 1898 in Alexandra, Victoria. She was committed into state care on the 17th of November 1902 in Melbourne, being neglected. The information says that she had been on remand since the 23rd of January. Her father was Charles Thomas Reynolds, who was deceased. Her mother, Agnes Reynolds, of 4 Little Gore Street, Fitzroy, was poor of good character. She had been in the women's hospital while the children were on remand, and the doctors of that institution held little hope of her being able to support the children. And it says that she already has a brother in care and a stepbrother in care. She was actually released to her mother on the 27th of May 1903. And it says that her mother had married on the 8th of November 1902 to Samuel Bilston of Fitzroy. Once her mother's remarried and she had more of a means, she's gone to her mother and her stepfather's home. Irene married Roy Robbins in 1918 in Carlton, Victoria, when she was 20 and Roy 25. Roy was a bookmaker and later a racehorse owner. They had a son, Alan, and Irene petitioned for a divorce on the 14th of May 1947. Irene Selina Robbins, 47, of Stanhope Court, South Yarra, against Roy Robbins, 50, of Queen Street, Melbourne, desertion, married 27th of March 1918 at Carlton. And Irene died on the 30th of December 1956 in East St Kilda, aged 58. The second child that Agnes had with Charles McGrath, or Charles Reynolds, was Walter Edward Reynolds. He was born on the 22nd of June 1900 in Coburg. He was committed into state care on the same date as his sister, the 17th of November 1902, and he was released at the same time as his sister was, back to their mother and stepfather. There is conflicting information in regards to Walter. He may have moved to Western Australia. He's not mentioned in his mother's death notice, so he could have moved over to the other side of the country and his mother just didn't have any contact with him anymore. So as mentioned, Agnes married Samuel Bilston, a bootmaker in Victoria, on the 8th of November 1902. They both stated that they were widows. Samuel was 39 and Agnes stated that she was 29 when she was in fact 33. They had 5 children together. Francis Clive Bilston, who was a twin, born on the 13th of June 1904, and he died on the 11th of July 1904 in Collingwood. His twin brother, Arthur Edgar Bilston, when he was 26, there was an article in the paper referring to him, stating that he worked as a farmhand on a property near Colac at DI. Said he worked for McLeod for 2 years. Arthur married Doris Hubbard and had 5 children with her, and he died on the 17th of June 1984 at Beaconsfield, Victoria. The third child they had together, Richard Gordon Bilston, was born in 1906 in Collingwood and died on the 24th of April 1908 in Carlton. The fourth child, Horace Aubrey Claude Bilston, was born in 1980 in Richmond. He enlisted in World War II on the 9th of January 1943 in Auburn, and he was in the 6th Australian Advanced Workshop and was discharged on the 12th of November 1945. He married Vera Corrigan in 1944 and died in Warrnambool on the 15th of May 1971. And their fifth child, Stanley Norman Ambrose Bilston, was born in 1910 in Collingwood. He was a concreter and married Edna May Pike in Caulfield in 1935. They had 3 children, and he died on the 12th of June 1976 at Chadstone, Victoria, aged 65. And Agnes was admitted to the Mont Park Asylum with terminal dementia on the 26th of April 1929 at the age of 59, and she died on the 9th of May 1931 at the asylum. Her daughter Irene visited her only 3 days before her death, and her death notice states, 6th of May, Mildred Agnes Bilston, dearly beloved wife of Samuel Bilston of Correndap, and loving mother of Irene, Mrs. Robbins, Arthur, Horace and Stanley, aged 58 years. Interestingly, you would have noticed that it was only the children from Samuel Bilston's marriage that were listed. So I hope you enjoyed the story on Herbert Charles Bazin and his family members.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.